outcomes-based contracts between pharma and payers, preparing for the future. My name is Al Salchunas, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Before we get to the presentation, I do have a few housekeeping items. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode, so no need to put your ringer on silent. Also, today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website by next week. Although lines are muted, we do encourage you to ask questions during today's presentation. Please submit any questions using the questions window located on the right side of your screen. Type your question into the box, click send, and they will be sent directly to a meeting organizer to queue for the Q&A session we will host at the end of the webinar. Should you encounter any technical difficulties during the webinar, please also utilize the questions window to describe your issue, and one of our support staff will follow up with you to troubleshoot. Throughout the webinar, we will also have a couple of polling questions to gather your input. When we reach those points, I'll read off the question, and you'll be able to select from a list of options. With that, I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's presentation. I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, John Pagliuca, Vice President of Life Sciences at CEO Health Analytics. John leads the commercialization efforts of CEO's advanced analytics and software as a service solutions within the life science market. He has more than 15 years of sales, marketing, and technology experience in quantitative analytics and software solutions for life sciences. Without further ado, John, take it away.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. I realize everyone's busy, so appreciate the time. We're going to spend some time today just quickly going through a little bit of who CEO is, to share that with the audience, followed by a bit of an overview, outcomes-based contracting, where are we today, followed by understanding patient personas, something specific to CEO and how we approach the thought process around outcomes or risk-based contracting. And we're going to finish with a case study, risk stratifying our CHF patient, meaning that we've got a specific drug in mind that we're going to share some insight around and how that type of information can be communicated with a payer and how the value flows to the patients. So that being said, a little bit about CEO. We're based in West Hartford, Connecticut. We're a global company. We were founded 10 years ago. We're 10 years old actually this year. We've got offices throughout the United States, 5 to be exact. We've got an office in the UK, just outside of London, and a relatively large office in Chennai, India. We've got a global follow the sun model within the organization. We've been growing organic and inorganically throughout the years. We've been acquiring complementary assets and people across the board. Our platforms deliver insights in outcomes across the healthcare spectrum. We work across healthcare within CEO. As Al pointed out, my group works specifically with life science clients. That's our expertise. But a very large piece of CEO also works closely with payers and PBMs and providers. We've got a lot of experience in both of those areas, and in today's world, it's valuable insight to share with our clients. We're backed by Sequoia Capital and Health Enterprise Partners. We're privately held, and fortunate for CEO, a great staff across the board, across the world. We've won numerous awards over the last 10 years at the Deloitte Fast 500. We're continuously at Inc. 5000 fastest growing company. We're partners with Microsoft. We're partners with Viva. We've won several awards as a result of that, and also Healthcare Informatics 100. A little bit of a background around CEO itself. really what makes CO a differentiator in the space, in the healthcare space today, is our bench strength. As mentioned, we work both on the payer side of the business and we work on the life sciences side of the business. We work with payers, PBMs, providers and healthcare service companies, and life sciences. On an annual basis, what we do extremely well is we understand data, specifically granular level patient and or member level data. And as a result, we analyze roughly 1 billion medical claims and 1.5 billion pharmacy claims annually. We have a lot of information flowing through our systems. You can imagine that the output of that information, those insights, vary by client to client, of course, based on their needs. In some instances, we're doing fraud, waste, and abuse for our clients, and as a result, we've had almost $600 million in annual client savings. We've retained roughly 95% of our clients throughout the years. Clients are happy. They come back to us. Happy to hear that, of course. We represent roughly 30 health plans. Over those 30 health plans, they cover roughly 100 million lives in the U.S. We work with 3 of the top 5 PBMs, 20-plus provider groups, and we work with numerous life sciences clients, but specifically 8 of the top 15 on a global basis. It's really our deep experience and our bench strength across all of these healthcare stakeholders that position us to really understand where things are moving with regard to outcomes and or risk-based contracting between payers and life science clients. A little bit about our predictive expertise, worth mentioning. We do have internal proprietary data that we can use at the patient level. It's de-identified naturally. We're not a data provider. We're an analytics company. So we can provide insights as a service around those data. Those data are updated for us on a monthly basis. It's roughly 20 million patient lives, looking back over 5 years. And we have a number of information specifically about those patient records that allow us to generate predictive and prescriptive models at the patient level around risk and potential outcomes. We also have taken that database and crafted that into a strong benchmark database across all 3 business lines, commercial, Medicare, and Medicaid. Really our bread and butter when we think about outcomes and we think about risks, and I'll talk about this in a moment, we think about personas. In today's world, the consumer or the healthcare patient is in fact the consumer. So the question then becomes, how do we identify the who and the what is the makeup of those patients? What compounds them on a day-by-day basis in a given condition, along with comorbid conditions? What are their propensities for chronic conditions? Are they adherent, compliant, and the reasons why? And really understanding today their risk of healthcare costs increasing, but more important, tomorrow, their prospective risk. And what does that mean to my organization? And how does that allow me to pivot or shift and work more closely with payers? We also build surgical prediction models at the patient level. Where, CO is a very innovative company, as I mentioned, we're an analytics shop first and foremost, and we've got a very deep bench strength of data scientists and clinicians and medical staff on board, but we're an equal part technology company. We also build SaaS solutions for our clients that are configurable, that produce the insights needed for their business on a day-by-day and week-by-week basis. We are very flexible in terms of our engagement model. Again, we look at insights as a service really as our core key. A lot of clients that we work with, as you can imagine in this day and age, acquire, purchase, have access to a lot of data. And data in and of itself, without a good predictive and prescriptive analytics wrapped around it, don't really tell us or paint us the picture of how to move the needle forward in the next 12 or 24 months. So that gives us a bit of a strength in the marketplace itself, and again positions us uniquely. We've done a lot of work specifically on the commercial side of life sciences. We've deeply entrenched with those teams and started thinking through how working directly with payers and how working directly with HCPs down to the patient level. That's our core strength. So that being said, a little bit of an overview, something here that most folks would see and understand, and wanted to share a little bit, where are we today? So when we look at sort of definitions and drivers, the U.S. healthcare system is that the cost of healthcare are increasing exponentially year over year. And the system itself, we all need to improve efficient and appropriate use of products and services. I mean, that's really what we're in this business for, and that's what's driving all of these conversations today. Fun fact, 3.35 trillion was the total healthcare spend in 2016. That number is going to increase 5.8% all the way up until 2025. 2025, ironically, is only 7 years away. It's not that far away. So these costs are ever increasing. The costs are also at this point last year are attributable to 32% was hospital care, 20% was physician visits, physician care, roughly 10% of prescription drugs through pharmacies. Those numbers are continuously increasing over time, and that's really the crux of these conversations as to if drug prices are a concern, impacting patient care and compliance is a chief concern for most of our clients and an ask for most of our clients. We've heard this in a few pockets over the last 12 months that on the payer side, that for the first time, they've seen drug benefit costs have surpassed medical benefit costs. Now, could be an anomaly, but we're starting to see that. At least we've heard that now in a couple of instances. That obviously is cause for concern on the payer side as well. Outcomes-based contracting, as we know, is intended to align the medicine itself or the device to its benefit. And what I'd like to add to that is, at the end of that, is saying, in the real world, we all know that the clinical benefit of most medications, but we really want to talk about in the real world, when put to practice and put to use, how does this help the patient and how does it drive overall care costs down? That's part of that conversation we'll dive into in a moment. So what we commonly see is and understand that manufacturers need to demonstrate the value of the product in terms of both clinical efficacy as well as economic quality of life outcomes via costs. That's the key component here. The common arrangements tie rebates or discounts to a measurable patient outcome, and there's a couple of obviously assumptions that have to go into that. What we always advise our clients first, going into these conversations and attempting alignment with payers around outcomes or risks. First, you need to identify and understand, well, what does risk mean to your organization versus what does it mean to your counterpart payer organization? I can tell you that risk means something different to everyone. So the simplified understanding of what risk means is a level setting platform. Looking at advanced modeling at the patient level and understanding both the concurrent, the today, as well as the prospective patient universe and the associated costs that are moving toward those patients, north, south, or no change, becomes a level setting, singing from the same sheet of music, piece of information that both organizations can generally agree to. Manufacturers, life sciences, agree to provide a rebate if the observed performance of a medicine doesn't reach the agreed upon thresholds, and therefore the cost of care patient increases. So obviously, if the cost of care of these patients is increasing over time, and the payer or the patient are not seeing the value of the drug itself, that's where the risk is coming into play for life sciences in terms of providing a deeper discount for the drug. On the flip side, if your drug is performing extremely well and we can justify and show cost of care for patients is decreasing and there's a benefit add there in terms of costs, well, then there's a next level conversation taking place with our clients and payers around what are the next levels of patients that have the highest amount of what we call risk and impactability, meaning that they are most receptive to messaging from both organizations in driving down total cost of care. We'll talk about that in a moment based on one of our case studies. Some of the benefits to this, it's really it's a triple win, right? At the end of the day, I mean, that's what we're all aiming for. But when we look at it from everyone's lens, from life sciences, from the manufacturer side of the business. The ability to provide an unbiased value of our product is critical in the real world. And again, I look at that and say, how do I show that the value is based on the cost of care of our patients using our drugs moving down? How are we contributing to that? Another way to look at the benefits on a manufacturer side, market expansion. From the commercial perspective, how do we look at a large pool of at-risk patients that are highly impactable and that are going to be receptive? You have the channel to message to patients, both DTC, but also through HCPs. And there is a way to identify pockets of patient segments to share that type of information with HCPs right down to the zip code or region level. It becomes very valuable, very, very strong messaging that can be had. You can further strengthen relationships with payers, which will lead to future quote-unquote win-win arrangements or agreements across, above the brand and across therapeutic areas within your company. In today's world, perception is important. It's not the sole piece of information, but being patient-centric or appearing patient-centric and being in it for the patient is critical. And a lot of clients do an excellent job of this. And that's being shown within the social media aspect of patients. Patients speak to each other. They share a lot of information. Information gets out there really fast. So those clients that are more patient-centric, if you will, on the surface than others, see the results. The other component to this, ability to share outcomes, again, unbiasedly, with your customers, whether that's an HCP targeting, whether that's specific hospitals or institutions, IDNs, those conversations and the facts of being able to show the value of that drug in a given condition, that helps drive focused messaging and ROI. And again, that's the conversation taking place today with payers and life sciences. On the other side of the equation, payers are obviously interested in this because, their chief concern is that care costs for patients are going up. They're skyrocketing. Total cost of care is becoming a problem. So how do we look at patients that are risk stratified and impactable, and how do we jointly attack that universe and try to drive care costs down? They want value, of course, like anybody else. They want to recognize value for the price being paid for a product, and they want to be able to pass it on to the patient. And then, of course, sharing the risk with manufacturers. That's sort of the end-all, be-all in all this. Down at the sort of lower side here within the patient level, as a consumer and as one who's somewhat, try to be cognizant of one's own health and costs. And again, healthcare costs are increasing dramatically across the board at a national level, but also at an individual level. For example, 2016, health out-of-pocket spending grew to about $375 billion. So as a consumer, I'm looking at this year over year saying, well, it's costing me more year over year for healthcare costs. How do I, as a consumer, drive that cost down? How is it in my best interests? How are manufacturers, life science clients, and payers working together with me to help drive these costs down? How do I receive, as a result of this, better outcomes, clinical, economic, and quality of life? I have kids. I want to be here for them for the next 40 years, and I want to be healthy and active with them, and possibly with grandkids. What does that mean to me? How do I focus on preventative care versus reactive care? And how do I partner with both providers and my payer in enabling that? And as a consumer, I really want to know what's in it for me. And now, ironically, what's in it for me is my health, of course. But some diseases, as we all know, are you cannot see them on the surface. Heart disease is a great example. So how do you make it real to the patient? How does that become real? Well, what I find, from a gamification perspective, show them what it costs them. Show them what it costs them from a future perspective. If you don't follow X, Y, and Z care pathway, A, B, and C is going to cost you at some point. Not only will it cost you potentially your health, but it'll also cost you out of pocket. Those conversations are currently happening, and that's really where we want to be able to drive care costs down across the board. But these are the benefits between all three segments of the market today. So key success factors, most important, and again, for years of doing this, commitment and trust is critical. Both manufacturers and payers need to commit the time and resources for the design, the implementation, and monitoring of outcomes-based contracts. Again, the ultimate goal here is healthy patients. Healthy patients drive down care costs, and also drive up adherence and compliance. What we also find, and a bit self-fulfilling from our perspective, having worked with a lot of clients over the last 15, 20 years, there could be an element of what we call self-fulfilling taking place. We see that payers and life sciences alike, there's a bit of a hesitation in some cases to fully believe or buy into the data that may come out of one or the other organization because they feel as it may be self-fulfilling to that organization. So where we slot into that is as a third party, completely independent, but again, in this for the outcome being the patient. That conversation seems to go over extremely well with our clients and a great talking point when also dealing with payers. It goes without saying that you need to clearly define metrics. The outcomes or the endpoints that have to be monitored over time have to be agreed upon and acceptable from the levels of success. And our chief medical officer will argue simplistic in that first year of outcomes or risk contracting. Yes, it's great and it's sexy to go after the most complicated contract or structure possible, but we often see that those don't meet their endpoints. They fail for whatever reason. There's multiple reasons behind it, and that we're often being called in with these clients to help them sort of bring those analytics back up to speed, or we look at how we could have helped them in a different way. So really, simplicity is key. Selections of conditions and products, let's face it, today, and this will change over time, not every condition and medication are great candidates for outcomes-based contracting. In some cases, there'll be, some cases with, for example, rare diseases. Today, probably not as necessary regarding outcomes-based contracting, although we're starting to hear and see some of those conversations percolate, but they may be a little bit behind versus other chronic-based conditions. The conditions and the products, need endpoints that are objectively agreed upon, and they have to be quantitatively, not subjectively, measured in a fair time frame. Based on the condition itself, are we looking at a measurement of a 6-month window or a 9-month window or a 12 or an 18-month window? That is extremely critical. And that's, as you can imagine, a hot talking point with a lot of clients today with payers. What exactly is the measuring point once we agree on what the pathway looks like? So these are some of the success factors that's worth sharing, what we see out there today. That being said, we're going to slide into our first poll question.
Thanks, John. The poll question that we are asking everyone to answer at this point in time is as follows. Where is your organization in terms of pursuing outcomes-based contracts with payers? Please answer the question now. Interesting result that most of you on the call are still in the learning and information gathering stage, where you're just getting your feet wet with 1 or 2 brands. So we're very early on regarding pursuit of outcomes-based contracts with payers, especially here in the United States. Interesting. Thank you very much for your participation. John, take it away.
Thanks everybody for that. So let's dive into understanding patient personas. And this is a CO mindset and a philosophical analytics field that we have across our organization. We talk about predictive analytics. We talk about patients. We talk about outcomes and risks. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to understanding the patient. Who is the patient? How does he or she respond to certain messaging? Why do they respond to certain messaging? And are they at risk of becoming sicker over time, or becoming more compliant over time, or remaining stable, if you will, from a no change perspective? So again, in today's world, there's a plethora of data available in the world, a lot of information, claims data, eligibility data, lab data, fitness, obviously volume data from a TRX perspective, socioeconomic, EMR devices. There's not one single point of location that has all of this information captured. It's coming in different phases. In some cases it's structured, in some cases it's unstructured. Confidently, we can say that claims data, eligibility data, lab data, socioeconomic data, to some degree EMR data, today is relatively secure data that we can use and that we use today to build our models. So when we look at taking in multiple pieces of data across the healthcare spectrum, we can identify and we can create models around, using medical and pharmacy claims, identifying patients that have the highest risk. What does that mean? Meaning that in the next 12 months, which patients run the risk of becoming non-adherent and costing more in terms of total cost of care within a given condition, along with comorbid conditions. That generally segues into a logical next question is, once those patients are identified down to the zip code level and stratified according to their quote-unquote persona, we can build models around, are there patients that look like this exact patient population based on cohort analysis that are currently not showing up on a diagnosis form, being diagnosed in the current condition? Are we confident that we can come back and show that here are pools of patients that have the same look feel as patients that are diagnosed and have a high degree of confidence that are in fact diabetic, have heart conditions, have COPD, whatever that might be? That's a conversation that's also evolving and flowing today between our clients, life sciences clients, and payers, and understanding how do you get ahead of the potential problem. So how do you risk stratify the current problem with patient universe, but how do you get ahead of the problem as well? So again, it's a crawl, walk, run scenario. So we're learning as we go. Of course, all of us are, but this is a logical pathway forward with the data that's available to us. Okay, so we build these prospective risk models, and we can build what we call impactability risk within those patients. So we're thinking about, how do I look at a patient? How do I look at how high of a risk that patient is of total cost of care increasing over time? And more importantly, how receptive is that patient or group of patients in listening to messaging around how they can improve their health over time? Then the question becomes, how do we tackle that? From the life sciences perspective, through our HCP channel messaging, through our payers with care pathway and care programming. The ultimate goal at the end of the day is medical reduction. We want to drive up quality and drive down costs. We want to help the organization, the infrastructure of these organizations do that. Adherence, compliance is on everyone's top of mind. That increases the cost of care. How do we message to patients? How do we understand why they're not adherent, not compliant, by persona type, and where are they, is the next logical questions. We want to understand using risk models to avoid hospital events or readmissions, and also models around end of life. We want to add clinical risk metrics or lab or high-tech imaging to adjust those models over time. That's the beauty of having data that are coming through over time that can further refine our models. So we think of prediction in a couple of different ways. At the end of the day, it really drills down to a patient persona. And we look at patients, and we can utilize the current data sets we have internally, or we can look at external data sets, again, de-identify claims data, EHR, zip level demographics, to create the predictive logic of understanding who these at-risk patients are, and the prescriptive analytics around how do I message to them? How do I know if they're going to be receptive to my messaging, which will then drive compliance, adherence, and ideally total cost of care down over time. The benefits of this for both organizations, for life sciences and in working closely with payers, is it becomes a dynamic way to manage the population based on outcomes and goals. Where are these patients? How do we message to them? How do we drive those messages home and move the needle and measure that effectively? From the provider perspective, how do we share performance management? How do they share, from a reimbursement perspective, how do they show that they are contributing to the lowering of care costs for patients and driving patients to the correct pathways of treatments? Obviously, each persona could be identified in terms of the pathways for individualized treatment patterns. You might find that a certain persona type is more receptive to a certain care pathway, and as a result, that pathway shows a significant decline in overall care costs over time. And ultimately, we're just driving towards greater compliance. I mean, that's really the key in all this, compliance and adherence for these patients. So a brief snapshot of what this looks like. I love sharing this slide. Again, this is just a snapshot of a profile of a patient persona, balanced adults. I jokingly say that this is, I'll include myself, the smallest patient population. There's not many of us balanced adults out there. But the reality is this: balanced adults, where are they in the U.S.? How to identify who they are? Socioeconomic metrics based on gender, education, home value, socioeconomic scoring. What are their age groups? What are their estimated incomes? And we look at also clinical attributes of these patients. How many times are they visiting the doctor's office? How many times are they visiting the ER? What's their average number of chronic conditions? These are all nice to have metrics at the patient personal level, but behind all of this represent the cost associated with all of this, and that's the critical component. So for example, in this fictitious world of balanced adults, these are high at-risk patients. Their general age group is somewhere in the mid-40s, their median age is around 42. What we find is they're high risk. And if you start to really drill into why are they high risk, well, they tend to be extremely active. They tend to injure themselves due to high level of physical activity. They've got a busy family. They've got multiple kids. They're running around from sport to sport, also while taking care of themselves, and in some cases, neglecting care for themselves. So we see this as a population that, based on the model, that represent a high risk of care costs increasing over the next 12 months. At the same time, these folks are highly impactable, meaning that there's a high degree of social intervention that could happen with these patients that could drive adherence and compliance. Could be simply informational, but also could happen through specialist intervention, depending on the condition itself. But this is the type of information that become available to us down at the patient level, again, de-identified, looking at it at a zip code level based on these segments of patients across the U.S. that start to lend itself toward why aren't these patients compliant, what is compounding them on a day-by-day basis with regard to taking their medicines, why are they at high risk, and are they able and willing to listen to the message that we're gonna move off to them, which ultimately drives down care costs for these patients. So that being said, next section I'm going to jump into a brief high-level case study, but before we do, we have one more question.
Thanks, John. This is poll question number two, and here's the question. What is the biggest challenge associated with successfully implementing and monitoring performance of outcomes-based contracts? Do you think it's defining contract terms as the biggest challenge, selecting the conditions and medications, agreeing on the metrics to be measured and monitored, or do you really feel that all of the above continues to be today the biggest challenge? Please answer the question. Well, it seems as if all of the above is the predominant biggest challenge associated with the implementation and monitoring the performance of outcomes-based contracts. It seems that we have a lot of work to do, and we're going to be taking strides together in addressing these particular challenges. Thank you for answering this question. John, take it away.
Thanks, Al, and thanks everybody for responses. So our last leg of the webinar today, I'm going to take you down a path of a high-level case study, and I'm going to paint the picture how, if I put on my managed markets strategist hat or my franchise leader hat, and think about a specific drug that we've developed for congestive heart failure and the benefits of that drug and how that conversation can be had with payers alike. So again, given the fact that we have data internally, it allows us to create a number of case studies and mine through information and insights. It's a great asset for us. What we did is we decided to take roughly a small patient population from our data set, about 4,300 patients, and we applied our risk scoring to that patient population. And what we came up with is roughly 3,600 of these patients out of the 4,281 are considered quote-unquote high risk. I'll move into that in just a moment, whereas another 641 are considered medium risk, of which 2,726 of these patients also have one or more comorbid conditions, COPD, diabetes, etc. 2,347 of these patients are on an ARB or ACE product as well. And our product A, we've identified about 566 patients, and product B, we've identified about 238 patients. So just as a level setting grounding, this is our small sample size, just mining through some of the data. Again, we're focused on product A. That's really our goal for today. So when we look at this next chart, irrespective of the drug itself, we're looking at CHF patients per member per month cost by risk segment, okay, over time. And we broke this down by facility, representing the blue bar, professional, representing red, and then RX, representing green. So what we can see right off the bat, no surprise, high-risk patients are very expensive, okay? Facility per member per month accounts for roughly 71% of the total per member per month costs, $4,930. The high-risk patients are the top 15% of sickest patients within the CHF universe, at least within our small universe. This is not uncommon. We see this across the board on almost every indication, every disease state, I should say. It could range anywhere from 10 to 20% of the patients are generally the sickest and account for roughly 80% of the total cost in that given condition. High-risk patients in this universe are 10 times more costly than the medium-risk patients. Again, no surprise, but the key is understanding who are those high-risk patients. So that's represented in these bars here. Obviously, we have the information at the zip code level to then map out where these patients are and identify them based on a persona type. That's critical. Next slide goes a little bit further down now. And now I'm putting on my brand manager or my managed market strategist hat. Our product A, we segment our patients by both high and medium risk. And then we also segmented our product B by high and medium risk. What you see on the screen here on the left for product A, that we have from a facility, professional, and RX per member per month total cost of care for the high-risk patients, it is dramatically lower than those patients that are taking our competitors' drugs. So just look at the blue bar. Facility cost itself, $2,820 per patient per year versus $4,962. Right there, as a marketer, there's a story to be had. Patients taking my drug, patients utilizing our drugs, are costing the healthcare system less. Obviously, we can drill into who are these patients and the reasons why. We have all the information underneath all of this. But that's the high-level conversation right here. For both product A at high risk and also for medium risk. So our drug is doing extremely well. And I've got a story to tell in terms of if our drug is contributing to the lower total cost of care for the CHF patient category, how do we start to think, Mr. Payer, and how do we start to justify migration of patients from product B, not our product, into product A? We are contributing to the lower cost of care for that payer and for those patients becoming healthier over time. So there's a conversation right here. So that gives me a little bit of a chip on my shoulder in a positive way. And again, this data was built by a third party, CO, unbiased against any internal type of data. So any kind of self-fulfilling conversation should be put to rest. This is based on pure CHF data in a de-identified patient-level data set. When we look at the next slide here, if we look at CHF high-risk patients by therapy type, if we look at product A, patients that are also taking an ACE or an ARB versus our competitor's product without an ACE or an ARB, without an ACE or an ARB, or an ACE or an ARB without product A, we also see the numbers are decreasing over time, meaning that even if we slice the data a couple of different ways, our product without an ACE, without a patient also taking an ACE or an ARB versus our competitors without an ACE or an ARB versus all the others, our care costs or our PMPM costs are also still lower. It's about 39% lower. There's a conversation to be had here. I mean, there's some cost justification and pathways that are taking place that are driving down patient costs for patients on our therapy. So when you look at that, 39% lower versus our competitor, 21% lower versus those on an ACE or only on an ACE or an ARB therapy. Again, very good talking points. All the underlying data sits underneath these bars. I won't bore you with that today, but it's all in there. But it really segues into this next conversation. And I apologize that this screen may look a little bit busy, but I think it's the easiest way to explain it and share. What we did is we took the current universe of patients. We look at all CHF patients, and we're only focused on high risk, so only focused on the gray and red outlined areas. And we created what we call a baseline, just a baseline measurement. So what we're looking at in inpatient acute, what that represents is that, or let's say emergency room, for patients that are all the CHF patients that we found in our universe, they are visiting the emergency room on average 1 time per year, but they are visiting the outpatient medical 28.4 times per year per patient. So the numbers are pretty dramatic, as you can imagine. But these numbers represent per patient per year on average based on a handful of different services. We broke it down very simplified. When you measure this against our product and look at the services being utilized by the patients on our drug, our patients are in the emergency room on average almost 30% less annually. They are 20% less utilizing outpatient medical services, 22% less outpatient surgical services, 27% ancillary services. If you compare that to our competitor's drug, which is the next bucket over, the high-risk patients are slightly higher than the baseline of all CHF patients. Again, there's a story here. Patients that are taking our drug are experiencing less overall services across the board. Patients who are taking our competitor's drug are experiencing at least the baseline, which is relatively high, or at least a small uptick in the baseline. How do we think about treating more patients? How do we think about educating more patients, educating additional HCPs? How do we think about outcomes and risks around these non-product A patients? There's a story to be had here, within this small sample of data. Now, I'm a numbers guy. I realize not everybody is, but really where I get excited, outside of being a New England sports fan, about numbers, I get excited on the next slide. And the next slide actually takes all the numbers we just saw and translate them into dollars. So Mr. Marketer, Mr. Managed Market Strategist, at the end of the day, all you need to look at is product A patients. What I'm showing you, Mr. Payer, is that patients that are taking our drugs, or our drug, are experiencing, on average per patient, $14,874 less outpatient medical costs per year. That's only one patient. Now let's multiply that by a large patient population. Those costs add up extremely fast. So in this case, for product A patients, those numbers in red in this case, good, meaning good for us, meaning that we are showing how patients taking our product are experiencing lower overall visits and associated costs on an annual basis. If you look at non-product A patients, our competitor's drug, it's at least at the baseline, again, all CHF patients, or slightly a tick higher. There's opportunity there. And again, this model that we built is unbiased. We do this for a living. Obviously, the model can be tweaked a number of different ways, but again, in a non-self-fulfilling way, the numbers don't lie. So the point that I wanted to share today in terms of sharing this with you is that when we think about outcomes and we think about risks, we need to think about drug costs. We need to think about the identification of the patient based on the persona type and identify how do we migrate patients that are experiencing higher costs on a future basis. How do we move them into the bucket that experience lower cost, better service, lower cost of care, lower number of service visits, if you will. That's being shown here in this. Those are the conversations that we encourage our clients to have with payers. These are the conversations that are forming today. Now, next logical question. Well, that's great, John. So what exactly do I agree to contract with from an outcomes perspective? What is the outcome? Well, it might simply be migration of non-product A patients into product A. It might simply be lowering overall emergency room visits for patients, something that's measurable. I don't have the answer today, and frankly, nobody does. But this becomes the starting point to have those conversations and agree on something measurable and simplified in the next 12 months and form a very strong partnership and bond which benefits at the end of the day three things: us from an adherence compliance perspective, our patients from a becoming healthier, lowering their healthcare costs in general, and of course the payer experiencing lower healthcare costs against per patient, per member per month overall. So that being said, I'm going to stop. I could talk about this all day. I get a little bit excited about numbers, and I apologize if it's a little too busy, but I wanted to share that type of insight of how we think and how this can be translated, from an outcome/contracting perspective. I think our next section is more of a Q&A, open Q&A section, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, John. Terrific job. We will now be entering our question and answer session, as John mentioned. And as a reminder, please submit your questions using the questions window located on the right side of your screen. I'll give you a few seconds to ask any questions that you have of John. John, there is a question. Why do you think that the United States has been slow to pursue outcomes or value-based contracts with payers?
Well, I can give you the long-winded answer or the short-winded answer. I think the biggest, and I'm by no means am I a subject matter expert when it comes to understanding all of the ins and outs of the system of payers and life sciences and contracting, et cetera. But I think really what the major issue is that we as an organization, we as a country are just turning the corner in terms of the consumerism of healthcare. We haven't been thinking that way over the last couple of years, up until the last couple of years, and that's changing. So suddenly the voice of the consumer is more prevalent. Care costs are increasing. The population is increasing in age, and frankly, in my opinion, I personally think that there's simply not enough education out there at the patient level. I know it sounds kind of wonky, but I don't think people think of their health in the form of both longevity of life and total costs. Those thinking processes are changing. I know that I'm thinking about that, especially those of us who have kids. How do I A, spend less on healthcare while making myself healthy and ensuring that I'm going to be around for the next 45 years? That's a really different dynamic today than it was before. So I think part of the issue has been there's been no rush to get there because there hasn't been really a lot of pushback from consumers and or patients. They've been just sort of go see the doctor, get checked out, and then move on. But that's dynamically changing. And the other component, too, is most countries have a single-payer system. So that's a different dynamic that we're dealing with here in the States. I don't think that will ever happen here personally. But so a couple different dynamics. But again, my thinking process always drives down to the patients and how the patient has more of a say today, sort of has woken up to the fact of it's hurting me in the pocket, it's hurting me health-wise. How are you going to help me change it?
Okay. Another question, John. How can both payers and pharmaceutical manufacturers contribute toward the success of outcomes-based contract? What are some of the keys there?
Yeah, I think the ultimate goal is, and again, I'm going to preach, what our Chief Medical Officer Kevin Keck has often stated. The initial stages of this is that you've got to establish trust amongst both parties. Every client works with payers, of course. There's been a bit of a relationship, in some cases a tumultuous relationship between payers and life sciences over the years. Level setting number one is gathering trust and trusting that I'm not in this just to promote more product. I'm in this to promote more product to help patients and lower overall cost of care. You're in this to drive down costs of patients as well. So there's a win-win across the board. What we will always preach, and again, we don't have all the answers, is that whenever any kind of conversation takes place, simplify it. It is a truly, we're in a world today of a crawl, walk, run situation because everything sounds great and sexy from an analytics perspective or making things more complicated from a measurement perspective. But we find is that the simplest way, it might simply be an agreement on a target population of patients. That might be an agreement that you start working on in the first 6 or 8 or 12 months. That's a great level setting to ensure that you guys can work together. So that's something that we stress, preach. Everyone sort of nods their head and agrees, and we've seen some success, based on that. So keep it simple.
Right. John, here's a question. Some pharma companies would like this data. However, they may have legal hurdles in linking product outcomes and contracting. How do you overcome this hurdle?
So there's a couple of thought processes here. Again, we have data. There's data available. We can sort of normalize the data and just to show simplified outcomes. What we find is that most of the clients we work with haven't had an issue potentially ingesting these data from us or through a third-party example, a payer themselves, or the data comes to us directly, I should say. And we can create the metrics around the information and then spit it back to yourself, life sciences, on a de-identified fashion, and then back to the payer themselves, and then where they can re-identify it if need be, they're going to want to. We find that from a compliance perspective, that tends to pass muster because, again, they're not handling the data, you're not handling the data. We're a HIPAA-compliant shop. We can manage the data, run the model, and run the outcomes thereafter, or measure the outcomes thereafter. So we haven't, just to be very blunt, we haven't come across that all that often. Naturally, some clients have more strict compliance guidelines than others, but we haven't come across that. Partly the reason because we're doing the analytics and the potential measuring of the outcomes on behalf of the client.
Thanks, John. We have time for one more question. Do you have some data in regards to the additional cost of running an outcome-based contract, including monitoring and so forth?
That's a good question. So think about operational costs. I guess that's the the overhead and the manpower that are included in all of that on both sides. And to be very blunt, we don't. And the reason being is that like most clients, we are in the early phases of this, and we are a lot of the work itself or the measurement of that itself is being offloaded to us. So we're providing it as a service for both organizations. So it becomes non-strenuous on the client side with regard to a managed market strategist or a project lead who is somewhat of the subject matter expert driving the process. But the management of the data and the metrics thereafter sort of fall on us. Therefore, it's more of an insights as a service than it is anything else. And there's a justifiable cost for that that the client can run based on how many man hours that they would use internally to do that themselves.
Thank you, John, for your presentation and for addressing the questions that have been submitted by the audience. I'd like to thank the audience for taking the time to join us today. If you'd like someone from CEO to contact you about what you've seen today, please visit the Contact Us page on our website. As a reminder, today's session was recorded and will be sent along to you in the coming days. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.